Okay, so Minix VMD is a fork of Minix that was created by Kees Bot and me somewhere early 90s. Halfway in the 90s we settled on this name. And in this presentation I will first give a brief overview of the history of Minix VMD. Then I look into some features that I now regret, but there's also some features that I still like. And then I look into the importance of eating your own dog food, and I show what I've been using it for in well, the last sort of, I can now say, couple of decades. So in '87, it was already mentioned by David, and we released Minix 1.0. I'm slightly older than David, so that was also the first year I started studying at VU, and I was blissfully unaware about the importance of this whole thing. And then in year 2 we had to do practical work on Minix, and then it was still a bit like, oh yeah, we have PSD on those faxes and we have this tiny Minix thing. But the nice thing about Minix is that, well, it doesn't do very much, so you could improve it. I mean, with Minix 3 that's no longer the case, but then that was certainly the case. And I wanted to be a PhD student, and I asked Andy, and Andy said no. That was disappointing. And then it was, well, maybe I can impress Andy with something. And I went over my old emails preparing this, and apparently on the 2nd of November 1990, I sent an email to Andy like, well, the TCP/IP version 0.1 is working. And apparently, well, it worked, because later I could become a PhD student. Then I selected a few interesting dates from emails. So May '91, I mailed Bruce Evans, and Bruce Evans was hugely influential in early Minix times, because not only did he create the protected mode version of Minix, and Minix 1.5 at that time was only real mode, he created the 386 version of Minix, and he wrote his own 386 compiler that you could run on 16-bit Minix to bootstrap the whole thing. And I got into an email discussion with him. Apparently he's still around. I now see him on FreeBSD mailing lists. I've never met him in person. We were discussing virtual memory, and he said, well, this guy said a year ago that he had virtual memory, and I haven't heard from him since. And then I mailed like, well, yeah, well, I was fed up with it. I decided to just do my own VM implementation. And then another interesting mail from this category is that 92, I got a mail from Kees that his boot monitor version 1.1 was there, and that I think that's sort of the start of my collaboration with Kees. And then another thing is in May of '92 I first talked about having asynchronous I/O, which was very important for Minix VMD, because at that time, if you wanted to do something like telnet or telnet or like whatever, you would fork the process, because there was no way to do, there were no non-blocking I/O, no select and whatnot. And asynchronous I/O is a natural fit for a message passing system like Minix. And not in this list is that a couple of weeks apparently later I wrote on Compose Minix about having Xterm, and then I promptly got a mail from somebody called Linus Benedict Torvalds, who was really interested in that and wondered whether I also had an X server. So apparently he didn't have one either at that time, which makes sense. Then 96, that's the first time I can find Minix VMD mentioned in my archive, because before what we used VMD, but we also used something like 386 VM, and then at some point we were forward looking and said, well, we may put it to another architecture once, and that never happened, but we dropped the 386 part. 97, this is a Usenet post by Kees, and then the organization is one Minix VMD system, it works. It was obviously posted from a system running Minix VMD. And the other interesting thing is the posting host called mega.amcsvunl, and AM stands for amoeba. This was one of a collection of 3 486 systems called Mega Giga and Terra, and there were also 386 systems called Nano, Atom, and Pico. And well, of course, by 97, those 486 systems were completely obsolete, so they could be repurposed for Minix VMD. So then, but apparently we kept the name for a while. And then another important thing happened, that in 2000 Minix became open source. So now if you look at the title, Always in the Shadow, so there's a couple of important things. One is I'm really bad at selling software. I mean, I can build it, somebody else has to sell it. So well, I don't really talk about anything I do in that sense, so that's a good reason for it. Then I was Andy's PhD student, and probably it's not a good move if you're supposed to do research to also have a very interesting open source project on the side. And then the third one was that during this time, Minix was closed source. I mean, yeah, you couldn't really distribute it. You were allowed to distribute patches, but it didn't make any sense anymore at the time. So it was, my feeling it was, well, Linux and BSD are the real thing because they're open source, and it's very nice that Kees and I are at the VU, so we have access to the sources of Minix and the ACK compiler, but because it's closed source, but you can't really do anything with it in an open source world. And then I think sort of the sad thing is that 2000, well, at least for me, Kees and I have been hacking on Minix VMD for a decade, and for me it was sort of, well, it ran out of steam. It is, well, we have a system that works, so I mean, let's move on to do other things. Then, something I certainly never expected is that Andy started Minix again, and now as a serious project to take over the world and whatnot. And I joined, I don't know, I think in May of 2005 or something like that. And apparently it also rekindled my interest to do something with Minix VMD, because I found that in January 2005 I committed the first VFS code in Minix VMD, and that's just a traditional VFS implementation. So it's all within FS, it's not running separate processes. But I just looked it up. David was telling about the problem of rename. Well, that doesn't happen in Minix VMD because there, sort of the rename VFS operation doesn't really do anything. It just has to execute the rename, and all the complex stuff is done by the generic code. And then at the end it says, and now do it. And then a couple of years later, I started working on adding IPv6 to Minix VMD. And also, in this, well, at this time, the situation was really changed because Minix VMD never was about changing the Minix microkernel. So now we have Minix 3, which was way more complex, could do way more things. And then, yeah, there was sort of no reason to talk about Minix VMD anymore. So it just stayed in the shadow. So that's my history, brief history. Then there were a couple of microkernel improvements. For example, one performance improvement is that if from a server you send a reply, then the next thing is you do a receive from any. Well, you can make that into one system call, and it goes a lot faster if the rest is already optimized. Early on, we decided that you shouldn't have hard-coded numbers for tasks everywhere, so it should be by name. And then the third was sort of, this is the only extension to the microkernel concept, and that was the introduction of INET, where INET starts as a normal user process. It reads as a normal user process the configuration file. It figures out from/dev what major device it's supposed to use, and then it tells FS, like, I want to be a driver with this major, and it also has to tell MM and the kernel that it wants to be a driver, and from that moment it is a driver. Coming back to going to fix that sort of didn't work as well. Initially, so for INET, I had to use the device driver model because, well, you were not supposed to really modify Minix that much, so it was natural to only use open, close, read, write, and reoctal. I used that internally in INET also, which leads to extra complexity at the same time. It also always worked essentially. So it's sort of It's bad for performance, it makes it harder to read, but it was also extremely reliable. But I had to make some changes later to get the performance right, and maybe there's some stuff I should do to make it something less ugly. So it's questionable whether that was a good idea. One thing it led to that's really a problem still today is that it led to very strict multi-homing, like you have to decide which TCP device to open, and then you only get that, and if you open the other one, then you only get that. So it's nice if you want that. I recently had to rebuild that under Linux, and it takes an endless list of IP table entries to get the same strict separation, but most people don't want it. And then the real failure was the introduction of a blocking system call, because the accept call that you normally have in sockets returns a file descriptor, and that doesn't fit the model. Only open can return a file descriptor. So then I decided, well, why do we need listen and accept? You do listen, and then it just blocks until there's a connection. Worked very well for a while, and then at some point you got web browsers that do 8 parallel connections, then 7 of them get connection refused. Then you introduce a hack that it just doesn't send the reset bit, then it just takes longer, and then at the end you have to find a way to implement accept anyhow. But I found a nice way to use some cookies, and then you can pass an open TCP connection from one TCP file descriptor to another, and then you can perfectly emulate the normal listen accept. So that's sort of INET. I think things that went wrong. Other than that, at least for me, it works. VM, well, I'm going to be very brief about that. The VM system in Minix VMD is extremely simple, and it's limited to 140 address space, and it also uses copy.access, and these days that's very limiting. So that's the problem, that it's now blocking forward progress, where you can port it to any other architecture without first completely rewriting the VM system. And here is an example of me being too clever. I wanted to do an NTP client, so I came up with a completely different way of NTP while using the same packet format, and I needed to have a kernel interface, and I looked at it and I thought, you know what, there's this timer chip, and it gets the input frequency of, I don't know, some megahertz, and it divides it until you reach the 60 hertz that Minix normally uses. And you see here in the bottom left is 19,886. That's typically what gets programmed into the limit register. And then I thought, if you look at that, that only has a granularity of 50 ppm if you do it as integers. Well, I can make it fractions. I just continuously reprogram that bit chip to get a fractional divisor. Works perfectly, except on any kind of emulator, which completely fails to understand this concept, because, well, nobody would be crazy enough to do that, so this is not something you should support. So that's 3 things that in retrospect were not such a good idea. I listed a lot of stuff done by Case, well, because it's better to give credit to somebody else. I think it's really sad that the Minix 3 dropped Case's boot monitor. I think it's still brilliant. One thing that it does is that from Minix VMD you can do regular BIOS calls. And for example, Minix VMD doesn't have a USB driver, but if you boot from a USB stick, then it can just do BIOS calls. So you can just boot from your USB stick and completely install from a USB stick, and you never know that Minix VMD actually doesn't have any USB support. Case also did a compiler driver called a compiler driver, which is also brilliant because it's a simple configuration file and you can actually understand what the driver is doing instead of all the nastiness everybody else seems to be doing. Case created the only partition table editor I ever found that I liked. And these flexible directories, which, well, just variable size directory entries, were hugely influential at the start of the project, because then Minix had a 40 character limit and then you can't do anything. David was talking about PS. The way Case solved PS was that you can export well, you see the kernel data structure is basically as a big matrix. The columns have names, and with query param you can just say, I want the column with this name, and it figures out with offset of where it currently is in the kernel. So you never have to recompile your PS because it will always match the kernel. But I assume that the MIB-based approach is sort of similar, but I don't know why you would do that with numbers. And Case also came up, this was really brilliant when people still didn't have internet, and that is, he found out that a CMOS time, the real time, which is always off by minutes, is actually very stable. It's just running at the wrong rate. So if you just spend a bit of time finding out the calibration parameters for your PC, then after that the CMOS is just perfectly accurate. You boot it and your system has the correct time. But coming to dog food, MINIXCon has been my home router since 2001, so continuously on. Before that I was using it in a dial-up with ISDN, so I have a variety of PPP versions that were in use. Then I have IPv6, I have DNS, both authoritative and resolving for a while. Since this summer I wrote the scripts to also do DNSSEC. I mean, code I had, but you still need to do all the signing procedures and something like that. And also a spectacular failure of not promoting something. Before I started working on Minix 3, I was asked by Andy and by Rudy to come up with a sort of a new version of SSH that was way simpler, and we did it, and it works. I mean, I'm using it today, and then nothing happened. We should have done a security review or whatnot and actually tell anybody. Nobody knows I'm using it between my systems, but that's a bit sad. Mail, Case heavily hacked. S-Mail, which is sort of a precursor to Exim, to work here for the computer science department on mail, works perfectly on MINIXCon. Then at some point I wanted to do my own block list and my own virus scanner, and today I read mail with MH. I use anti-Word if somebody still has old Windows Word files. Doesn't work so well on the newer stuff. Links minus dump converts any HTML in ASCII that you can't click on, so you can't accidentally click on stupid stuff, so it's safe. And there's GPG if you want to sign something. Usenet is still a bit alive. There's a heavily hacked leaf node such that it can do multiple upstreams, and TRM for reading, and some the very original NCSA SPD with some security bugs fixed, of course. Backups is a clear example of why beating around dog food is good, because it causes me endless amount of trouble and that encourages fixing. For example, MINIXCon cannot handle files bigger than 4 gigabytes, which is now a serious problem. Long time nobody essentially had any files. I'm not doing any much multimedia. But now they're popping up left and right. And at some point I was digitizing or ripping my CDs, also classical CDs, and then you have titles with insanely long track names. And then it turns out I had a bug that was only triggered if the file name length was exactly 128 bytes, which never happens except if you have a randomly random collection of classical music. So the nice thing is, if you do that, then you're encouraged to fix it, and otherwise you would just let it be. And I had another problem, and that was at some point Case started learning. No, to say it differently. Case always had attention to detail. So if you see my code and it has lots of extra debug output and all kinds of stuff like that, and the Case said, well, it has to go, and he would make sure that all the system administration scripts were right, and there was documentation and whatnot, and make distributions. And then at some point Case discovered Japanese, and then Case was sort of gone. So over the years I've spent a lot of time to make a script that automatically can now generate CD and USB images, such that I can, at least, I don't have to copy hard disk images from one computer to another to create a new install. But I still haven't got to actually deleting debug output or writing documentation. And somebody remarked like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we actually had the source? So I made some yesterday random scripts to create CD and USB images and put them up on my server, which of course is running Minix VMD. So that's the end of my talk.
Any questions?
The virus scanner, was it like your own scanner for viruses, or was it a scanner that was looking for your own viruses?
Well, that was funny. At some point, Microsoft made a mistake, and there's a UU encoded format, which basically says you start with at the beginning of a line, then you have begin space octal file mode, and then the file name, and then you get UU encoded stuff. And then they didn't bother to check whether that format was there. So if you had begin space space and then some file name, and even though you encoded stuff, then all of the virus scanners under Windows already started barking. So at some point I had to use that signature, said begin space space, I'm a horrible virus.exe, and then nothing else. And then people started complaining like, you have a virus in your post, and what? So that's the only virus I ever wrote. But the virus scanner was looking for, and I mean, I'm using Unix systems, so the viruses were never active. But in the my Doom time, you got sort of 90% of your mail was viruses. And that's the point where I thought, okay, I want to get rid of those viruses. I don't trust antivirus companies. I have to write my own virus scanner to get rid of that junk.
Cool. Any other questions? Well, let me ask one. How do you see the future of Minix?
In the shadow.
I mean, do you plan on doing more work on it? Do you see convergence with Minix 3?
There's no reason why it can't sort of convert or maybe move features from one to the other. So I'm using it, and in that sense, I want to keep it alive. If there's interest in, I mean, it doesn't have to be interest in specifically Minix VMD, it can be interest in features or whatnot, then it may make sense to move it to Minix 3 if that. So I have no plan sort of for the future other than I'm running it, so I want to keep it alive and to see. But maybe take it a bit out of the shadow and see if other people can be inspired or interested in it. Yeah.
And just to confirm, the license is the same as Minix 3 now? Because you mentioned the license originally.
Well, that's one of the things. We have a nice website, minix-vmd.org. That's all set up and maintained by Case, which also has all the licenses, etc., but nobody ever bothers to look at it.
Okay.
So all those details are spelled out, and it's just a normal BSD license. Yeah.
All right, no more questions? Then let's thank the speaker.